The operator asked the standard questions. Where are you? What happened? Zrenia, is she breathing? On the bathroom floor, in an unnatural position, lay a woman. She was already dead. There was a gunshot wound in her head. Next to her was a pistol. The first signs were suicide. But experienced officers immediately felt that something did not add up in this picture. The pistol was lying next to the body, but not in the way it usually falls from the hand. It was neatly lying to the left of her, although Alex was right-handed. Moreover, there were no traces of a shot at close range, no traces of soot on the palms, no characteristic burns that appear when shooting at close range. Forensic experts also examined Matthew's car. In the glove compartment, they found a printout of their correspondence, underlined with a marker. In the trunk, fabric gloves and a tightly folded jacket, in the pocket of which there was a flash drive. Dear viewers, in the next video releases, you will find very intriguing and confusing cases. And in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Alexandra Penning, who was called Alex by all her close ones, was the kind of person they say she was born to help. Blonde, with lively eyes and an open smile, she seemed older than her years from a young age, not in terms of appearance, but in her inner world. Alex knew how to listen, feel the pain of another person, and do it without judgment. That is why she chose medicine, first studying to be a licensed nurse, then working in the emergency room. And although the path was not easy, especially in conditions of overtime and stress, she never complained. Alex believed that her job was to be there when others feel bad. She was born and raised in Minnesota. Her family, her father, mother, and younger brother, lived in a small house in the suburbs of St. Paul. An ordinary American middle-class family. Her parents often worked late, and Alex took on the care of her brother since her teenage years. It was then that that very character began to form in her. Caring, but at the same time reserved, taught not to show weakness. Already in high school, Alex knew that she would go into medicine, not out of a desire to earn money. At that time, she seriously considered becoming a paramedic, but out of a desire to be useful, to be needed. After college, she got a job at a local clinic, where she quickly earned the respect of colleagues. Alex was not just a nurse. She was a person to whom people came for advice, even those who had worked at the clinic for decades. Reserved, responsible, never breaking down. But with this strength came another side. She also kept her pain to herself. She rarely discussed her personal life, although friends knew. Alex had several unsuccessful relationships, one of which ended very badly. By the age of 32, Alex Penning had been through a lot. There were dark periods. The struggle with addiction to prescription drugs, the effects of emotional burnout, therapy, in which she sought a path to herself, but all that seemed to be in the past, at least on the surface. Towards the end of 2022, she was, in the words of her family, in a good place. She had moved into her own apartment, worked a lot, and sometimes attended yoga classes. She started laughing again, not politely, like before, but for real. Everything was getting better. But, as often happens, behind the outward well-being, there were things that not everyone knew about. At that time, Alex began dating a man named Matthew Acker. He was older than her, a physician assistant who worked at a nearby hospital. The relationship began quietly, without unnecessary publicity. They met at an inter-hospital conference and started talking about difficult shifts and emotional burnout. A connection quickly developed between them, a deep but difficult one. Matthew was smart, charismatic, and self-confident. He knew how to speak beautifully and gave the impression of a person in control of everything around him. And it seemed that this was what won Alex over. Tired of the chaos of her own life, the relationship developed slowly, almost in the shadows. Not because they were embarrassed about anything. They were both just careful. Alex, according to her friends, did not like to put her personal details on display. And Matthew, he was generally a closed person. Almost no one really knew him. Yes, his colleagues spoke well of him, professional, punctual, impeccably dressed. But at the same time, it seemed like he was always a little apart. His past was shrouded in fog. There were rumors that he had a difficult divorce, that he rarely saw his children, that he had faced complaints about his behavior in the past. But nothing concrete, nothing official. Just scraps of conversation in the hallway. Over time, Alex began to notice warning signs in the relationship. According to her friends, he began to show signs of control. He asked who she was texting, checked when she was online, asked questions about her male friends. Several times she admitted that he could suddenly become cold, switch off, or, on the contrary, unexpectedly flare up. She began to doubt. Was she still herself in this relationship? But at the same time, she was afraid to take a drastic step. Alex believed in people, gave them a second chance. Perhaps too often. In November 2022, she began dating another man, Shane Anderson. He was not from a medical background, but he was simpler, more open. She felt lighter with him, and perhaps began to believe that she could leave the old, painful relationship. But she did not tell Matthew right away. Perhaps she did not want a conflict. Perhaps she hoped that everything would resolve itself, but nothing resolved. On the contrary, everything began to rapidly escalate. On December 15, 2022, Alex, Matthew, and Shane found themselves in a bar. A chance meeting that would turn out to be the starting point. Security cameras showed Shane approaching the couple, engaging in conversation, and then a fight. Shane punched Matthew, after which he was escorted out of the establishment. Alex looked agitated but stayed with Matthew. After the fight, Alex couldn't come to her senses for several minutes. She stood at the bar and seemed to be trying to decide something for herself. Matthew, despite the blow he received, showed neither aggression nor shock. He silently drank water and watched her. Several patrons turned around discussing the situation, but the couple seemed not to notice anyone else. The bartender later recalled that Alex looked not so much confused as internally crushed. She returned to the table and tried to call someone, but seeing Matthew's look, she put the phone away. Their conversation at the table was short, restrained, as if they were both afraid to say something unnecessary. At 00:42, cameras recorded them leaving the bar. She, one step ahead, he following, with his hands in his pockets. In the parking lot, they stopped at her car, and an argument broke out between them. Alex was gesturing, proving something, and Matthew stood almost motionless. A couple of minutes later, the argument stopped, and they drove together towards her house. On the way, Alex wrote a short message to her friend. He's silent again. He's pressuring. This was not the first alarming message related to Matthew in recent weeks. Alex shared with her friends that he had become unpredictable and that she felt glued to the wall. Upon arrival home, they did not immediately enter the apartment. They spent about 10 minutes in the car. One of the neighbors later reported that he saw them standing at the entrance, and Alex lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. There were no longer loud conversations between them in the apartment, but the atmosphere was tense. Alex turned on music in the bedroom, as if trying to create at least some background music to drown out her internal anxiety. Matthew went into the kitchen, poured himself some water, and stood by the window for a long time without moving. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was heavy, as if he already knew something. That night, everything that had been unsaid over the past months hung between them. A thick, almost tangible silence. December 16th, 2022. Minnesota. The streets were still breathing the pre-dawn silence. It was about 5:30 in the morning when the duty station received a call. The man's voice on the line sounded tense, but there were no obvious signs of panic. He introduced himself, Matthew Acker. He said that he was in the apartment of his girlfriend, Alexandra Pennig, that he heard a gunshot, and that he was trying to open the door. The operator asked the standard questions. Where are you? What happened? Zrenia. Is she breathing? But Ecker couldn't give a clear answer to many of them. He was confused in his wording. He said that she locked herself in the bathroom, that he broke down the door, and that there was a gun next to her. His own. A few minutes later, police and paramedics arrived at the specified address. It was an ordinary, unremarkable apartment in a multi-apartment building. Silence behind the door. Inside, dim lighting, an uncleaned kitchen, signs that the night had been long. On the bathroom floor, In an unnatural position lay a woman. She was already dead. A gunshot wound to her head, a gun nearby. The first signs were suicide, but experienced officers immediately sensed that something didn't add up in this picture. First, the dried blood. This meant that death had not occurred a minute before the call, probably an hour, maybe more, before the police arrived. However, Ecker claimed that he had heard the gunshot only recently. The time frame did not match. Secondly, Matthew himself. When he was questioned at the scene, he behaved strangely. Not hysterical, not crazy, but reserved, even cool. He said that the gun belonged to him, was kept in the car, but that he had taken it to the apartment that night just in case. He said that Alex was upset, that after an argument at the bar she had withdrawn into herself. He said that he tried to calm her down, but she suddenly went into the bathroom and locked the door. And then, the gunshot. The officers carefully examined the scene, and here more details appeared that raised doubts. On the inside of the lock of the bathroom door there was a small metal ring, the latch mechanism. It was lying under Alex's body. This was impossible if the door was really locked and it was opened after the shot. The only logical conclusion, the door was open until the moment of death, or at least open before the body hit the floor. So Matthew's version was falling apart. There was no water on the sink. Although Acker claimed that after breaking down the door, he washed his hands of blood. The sink was dry, no traces of water, no drops on the floor. And that meant he was lying. The bathroom itself looked atypical for a suicide. Firstly, the position of the body. Secondly, the position of the gun. The gun was lying next to the body, but not in the way it usually falls from the hand. It was neatly lying to the left of her, although Alex was right-handed. Moreover, there were no traces of a shot at close range, no traces of soot on the palms, no characteristic burns that appear when shooting at close range. The gun, in fact, seemed to end up next to her, but not as a result of a natural fall. The forensic scientists began to photograph every corner, every detail. From that moment on, the case ceased to be routine. It became criminal. Matthew was taken away for questioning. Not as an accused, just as a witness. He still stuck to his story, that they had returned from the bar at about 1 a.m. Alex was depressed. He tried to calm her down, but she was becoming more and more withdrawn. He claimed that he hadn't expected a tragedy, but then he heard a gunshot. Then he broke down the door and saw what he saw. But the investigators already knew. His story was a patchwork quilt, tight in places, but with holes that couldn't be ignored. He claimed that Alex had started acting strange at home, talking about being scared. Allegedly, she was worried that Shane was a danger. Matthew said that he had offered to stay with her. He went to the car, got the gun, and, in his words, just in case, brought it into the apartment. This moment attracted special attention from the investigators. Why would a man who claimed that his girlfriend was unstable bring a loaded gun into the house? Why would he, a medical professional with experience, decide that a gun was appropriate? Why didn't he call the police if he said he was afraid for her safety? These whys piled up like a snowball. Next is his claim that Alex locked herself in the bathroom and refused to talk. He says that after some time, he heard a gunshot, that he broke down the door, that it was too late. But the forensics experts already knew. The door was broken down before the moment of death, and the blood on the floor began to clot long before the 911 call. Everything pointed to the fact that Alex died much earlier than Matthew claims, that he spent hours in the apartment next to the body, not calling for help, and, possibly, hiding something. Traces of DNA, fingerprints were seized at the scene, and measurements of the shot's trajectory were taken. According to ballistics, the shot was fired from a distance exceeding the length of an outstretched arm. That is, the shot was not self-inflicted. Moreover, the direction of the trajectory, from top to bottom, at an angle, is extremely atypical for suicide. Ecker, at this point, continued to insist. He had done nothing. It was a tragedy. He had loved her. He had tried to help her. He had said that she had been broken after the bar fight, that she had spoken of fear of Shane. But the further the investigation went, the clearer it became. The truth was quite different. On the second day of the investigation, surveillance cameras were examined, both in the bar and on the street near the house. Something strange arose. It took more than 40 minutes to get home, while the journey to the apartment usually takes no more than 15. This was not enough time. Alex's phone was active during this period, but no calls were made from it, only opening a messenger, then turning off the screen. One of the digital trace experts would later say, they tried to unlock the phone, but without success. 3 false attempts. Alex's friends were questioned in the first days. They told about strange correspondence, disturbing voice messages. The correspondence between Alex and her friends spoke for themselves. She wrote that she doubted her relationship with Matthew, that he was jealous, that she felt as if he was looking through her, not at her. In one message sent a week before the tragedy, she wrote, "I don't feel safe with him, but I'm not ready to break things off yet. He can be very persuasive." In another, she admitted, "I think he's following me. I'm not paranoid. It's just that there are little things you can't help but notice." One fragment of the correspondence was especially important. "He doesn't scream. He just turns off my air." Alex left this message just a day before the fateful night. Forensic experts also examined Matthew's car. In the glove compartment, they found a printout of their correspondence, underlined with a marker. In the trunk, there were fabric gloves and a tightly folded jacket with a flash drive in the pocket. Later, an examination would show that the flash drive contained an audio file, a recording of Alex's voice, most likely recorded without her knowledge. What exactly was on it was not included in the case. The lawyers managed to exclude this evidence from the protocol, citing a violation of privacy. Nevertheless, the investigation continued to piece together the puzzle. Alex had not updated her social media posts for 2 days before the tragedy, which was unusual. Her stories were deleted, as it turned out, manually and from her device, but at a late time, when, according to experts, she was already asleep. This gave reason to believe that someone else had access to her phone. Matthew, of course, denied this. A psychological examination of the couple revealed important details. Matthew was characterized as restrained, prone to passive aggression, with a pronounced desire for control. His behavior was described as emotionally detached, but strategically calibrated. All this, coupled with inconsistent testimony, alerted investigators. 2 weeks later, the case went from a tragic incident to a criminal investigation into a violent death. The official motive had not yet been announced, but the prosecutor's office was already preparing to bring charges. Everyone was waiting for only one thing: the forensic report. It turned out to be a turning point. When the experts announced the results of the ballistic and trace examinations, the investigation finally received the crack in Matthew's version that allowed them to look deeper. The bullet entered at an unusual angle, from top to bottom, with an unusual trajectory for a self-inflicted shot. Moreover, the trace of the shot was not typical for a close range, as Matthew claimed. This gave rise to the main question: could it have been suicide? The forensic experts recreated the scene to the nearest centimeter. They used a mannequin similar in height and build to Alex, recreated the lighting, the arrangement of objects. The results did not favor the suspect's version: the position of the body, the distribution of spatter, the angle of the entry wound. Everything pointed to an external influence. One of the investigators said in an interview, "We had a feeling that we were not dealing with an impulsive act. It looked like something thought out, almost theatrical." An important element was the analysis of Matthew's behavior for 2 weeks after the tragedy. He refused to comment publicly, did not contact Alex's friends, and completely isolated himself. During interrogations, he answered questions, but showed almost no emotion. Psychologists who observed him noted a low level of affective reaction, which is considered an alarming signal in such situations. At the same time, investigators began working with digital evidence. They recovered data from Matthew's laptop and tablet. The browser history contains dozens of requests related to manipulation methods, forms of psychological pressure, and the specifics of lie detectors. 3 weeks before the incident, he searched for articles with the titles "How to Recognize Treason by Nonverbal Signs" and "What to Do If You Have Been Betrayed." This data was included in the case as possible confirmation of motives. In addition, it became known that Matthew, a few days before the incident, submitted a request to delete Alex's account on one of the medical portals, where she stored information about an upcoming promotion. When asked about the reasons, he replied, "I just wanted to protect her." But from what, he did not specify. Alex's friends told about a strange incident on the eve of the tragedy. At a group dinner, she seemed afraid to leave her phone unattended. One of the girls recalled, "She kept it in her hand even in the bathroom. She said that Matthew had become too intrusive, but she was afraid to anger him." These phrases began to acquire new weight. Particular attention was drawn to that very 9-minute interval between the gunshot and the call to 911. One of the forensic experts said, "In cases like this, every second counts. If he was really trying to help, then the call would have been immediate." At the request of the prosecutor's office, a simulation was conducted. Even with shock and panic, a person in the same apartment could have called within 40 seconds. 9 minutes is too long. The investigation was faced with a lack of direct witnesses, but circumstantial evidence began to form a chain. Among the evidence was a note found in Alex's diary. Handwritten, undated, it contained one phrase: "If something happens to me, it won't be me." An examination confirmed the authenticity of the handwriting. For the prosecutor's office, this was enough to initiate a review of the case status and request an arrest warrant. At the end of January 2023, Matthew Acker was officially arrested on suspicion of involvement in the death of Alex Penning. He was charged with manslaughter with aggravating circumstances, including pressure on the victim, concealment of evidence, and giving false testimony. This was a turning point. From tragedy to criminal case, from suspicion to accusation. But everything that remained outside the evidence, feelings, hints, fears, tension between the lines, now had to be heard in court. On May 15, 2023, the Hennepin County courtroom began the trial of the state versus Matthew Acker. This was not just a trial about a personal tragedy. It was a trial about silence that accumulates over the years, becomes heavy as concrete, and at some point collapses on the heads of everyone who was nearby. Matthew appeared before the court as a defendant. He was charged with a crime with aggravating circumstances, intentional psychological pressure, concealment of important details, untimely appeal for help. The wording was dry and legalistic. But behind them were months of tension, unbearable closeness, words that were not said, and those that were spoken too late. At the first hearing, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Present were not only representatives of the press and Alex's loved ones, but also ordinary people who were struck by the story itself. Their faces reflected distrust, fear, and for some, a vague hope that the truth would finally be heard. The judge made it clear right away. Emotions would not be the basis of the trial. Only facts, only evidence. But in this case, the facts were not always obvious, and the truth did not always succumb to logic. The prosecution built the case methodically. Their strategy was simple: to show a chain of consistent actions indicating a systemic psychological impact, which, according to the prosecution, led to the tragedy. The main emphasis was not on the moment of the incident, but on the months preceding it. Digital correspondence, diary entries, testimonies of Alex's friends and colleagues, all this formed the basis of the prosecution's line of evidence. Several of her messages to friends were read out in court. "He looks, but says nothing. It's worse than screaming. I feel like I'm walking on glass. If I could just disappear, I would disappear." Each phrase sounded like a separate cry for help, archived in a chat. The prosecutor called it a silent diary of fear. On the third day, the court called its first witness, Carly, a close friend of Alex. She looked composed, but her hands were shaking. When asked to talk about the last weeks of her friend's life, she remained silent for a long time. She stopped laughing, Carly finally said. She used to have this sparkling laugh, and then nothing. She looked out the window, held her phone like a shield. She said he was different. I didn't know what it meant until it was too late. The defense lawyers did not deny the difficulties in the couple's relationship, but insisted that the incident was a tragic coincidence. the result of an emotional breakdown on both sides. They tried to portray Alex as a person going through an internal crisis, and Matthew as a man in a difficult situation, unable to cope. But this version began to crumble at the seams when a digital security expert was called into the courtroom. The specialist said that search queries dated 10 days before the tragedy were found on Matthew's tablet. Among them were how to read other people's correspondence without access to the password, what to do if a girl hides correspondence, the psychology of jealousy, and how to understand that you have been betrayed. The judge allowed some of this data to be shown to the jury. The tension in the courtroom increased. These were not just curious queries. These were attempts at control. Later, one of the witnesses, a former colleague of Matthew, said that he often complained about Alex's detachment. He said that she seemed to be slipping away, that there was less warmth in her. I then thought, a common story. But now, Zrenya, the witness's voice broke. On the 6th day, the court heard an audio recording made by Alex 2 weeks before the tragedy. It was a background recording from a dictaphone, possibly accidental. It contains a conversation. Alex speaks quietly, excitedly. I don't know what to do with you anymore. You are silent all the time, disappearing. It is as if I live with a shadow. Matthew's answer was inaudible. Only silence, the sound of movement around the room and a heavy breath. This recording became the emotional peak of the hearing. Several people in the room were crying. One of the jurors looked away. When it was the turn of the defense, they tried to return the trial to the realm of facts, not emotions. 2 psychiatrists were invited to analyze Alex's emotional state. One of them concluded that she could have had an acute stress reaction and a borderline state. The prosecutor immediately demanded that these conclusions be excluded as hypothetical. The judge allowed them, but with the proviso that they were not a medical diagnosis. The lawyers also referred to the lack of direct witnesses. They reminded that no one saw what happened inside the apartment that night. All the evidence was circumstantial. But it is in cases like these, as the prosecutor emphasized, that everything comes together from details, like a mosaic. He took the jury through the chronology, the parking lot camera, the argument by the car, the text messages on the way, the behavior at the bar, her note, "If something happens to me, it won't be me." Alex's family spoke on the 7th day. Her brother, briefly and almost emotionlessly, said, "She wanted to leave." He knew. We all knew. But we didn't know what he was capable of. The father's words were restrained, almost legalistic. My daughter deserved her freedom. She tried to break free, but she fell into a trap that is not visible from the outside. This is not a story about a loud conflict. This is a story about silence that weighs down. After 8 days of hearings, the jury retired to consider its verdict. The room held its breath. For 13 hours, they analyzed materials, compared testimony, re-watched fragments of audio recordings and video surveillance. The judge forbade journalists from approaching the deliberation room. The anticipation was tense. The next day, shortly after noon, the jury returned. The verdict was announced in a silence in which no one in the courtroom seemed to be breathing. Guilty of count 2, aggravated felony. Matthew remained seated, showing no visible reaction. His lawyers whispered, he nodded. But his face remained stony. Alex's family, sitting in the front row, said nothing. Only her mother clutched her daughter's pendant, a small silver bird that Alex had worn since she was 16. This trial had become not only a search for the guilty party, but also a conversation about boundaries, between care and control, between love and dependence, between anxiety and danger. Alex could no longer speak, but her words, written down, saved, retold, had been heard. And they had been heard.